Hi folks, Larson Halleck here. Let's talk about Hollywood. As I may have mentioned once or twice in my writing and or videos, I'm something of a cinephile. From the early feeling out process of the silent era to the overblown crapfest we're given today by Hollywood, I adore cinema as a form of art. However, being a person of color, according to the one-drop rule anyway, there is always that nagging elephant in the room about the allegedly horrible racial stereotyping in Hollywood that gave the white devil stereotypes to use against the noble POC for generations. And of course, desexualized, insert ethnic group of your choice, and turned them into sexless buffoons and goose, the effects of which are still felt to this day. As I've argued repeatedly, the rise of social justice amongst various racial groups within modern America largely revolves around sexual frustration rather than any legitimate complaints. I mean, if the most you have to complain about is meaningless pop culture flotsam, that would suggest that as of right now, you've got it pretty good. With that being said, yes, stereotyping and racism certainly did exist in Hollywood and American media on the whole for decades. I am certainly not disputing that. What I am disputing, however, is the idea that these stereotypes were such evil and powerful misdeeds that they ruined the sexual opportunities for minorities until, yesterday. The main reason I am disputing this is because, for some racial groups more than others admittedly, there were almost as many, if not just as many, relatively positive depictions of them in media as there were negative and stereotypical depictions. Let us look at my people first, and judge the stereotyping of them in popular media on the whole, since that's literally about 95% of what they complain about. Sure, yellowface is offensive, and it was often used for cheap laughs. And by my reckoning, whenever an Asian SJW starts talking about anything, it'll probably be 10 minutes or less before they start whining about Mickey Rooney in Breakfast at Tiffany's. And why not? By some accounts, the Mixter himself seemed to be somewhat embarrassed by his role in his later years. So I don't blame people for being offended by it. But in some cases, portrayals of Asians could be far more progressive in the proper sense of the word than the grievance mongers would have you believe. Are you aware, for example, that one of the earliest interracial romances ever filmed in any country was between an Asian man and a white woman? Why yes, that is the D.W. Griffith in the byline, as in Birth of a Nation D.W. Griffith. Comparing Griffith's two films here is the first instance I will point out of a very common phenomenon in American culture. Namely, racism, even if it is present, will not be doled out evenly. Some groups got it worse than others. While America certainly had discriminated against Asian people in the past, it was never, no matter what the SJWs will tell you, anywhere near as bad as the way black people were treated. Laws were passed in California protecting Chinese-owned businesses from discrimination as early as the 1880s, and school segregation between whites and Asians, again at least in California, was outlawed as early as 1906, as this picture will indicate. Then again, considering that Griffith was an almost stereotypically waspy southern gentleman, it is not so surprising that he was far more tolerant of Asians than he was of blacks. That seems to be a fairly recurring trend with the Southrons, as the surprisingly egalitarian example of Ching and Eng, the Siamese twins, might suggest. Not to be outdone by founding stock Americans, the Italian-born Frank Capra also portrayed a relationship between a Chinese man and a white woman positively, and he did so explicitly aiming to tear down stereotypes. As a side note, isn't it a little weird how immigrants back then, like Frank Capra and Irving Berlin, produced media that showed their love for their new country, and yet nowadays so many immigrant celebrities seem to genuinely hate and despise their new country? And I'm just going to say it right now. Anybody who says Charlie Chan or Fu Manchu are negative stereotypes that hurt Asian men need to shut the hell up. Much like the bitter tea of General Yen I just referenced, the Charlie Chan character was created specifically to present a positive portrayal of a Chinese man who was also, by the way, based on a real guy who has gone on record as enjoying his fictional counterpart. But hey, maybe I'm too whitewashed to understand why a brilliant, dapperly dressed detective who is explicitly shown in at least one film to completely outclass and make a fool out of the white inspector he works with, and is also explicitly shown via his multiple children to have an active and healthy sex life, is some sort of negative stereotype. And as for the archetypical sinister Chinaman Fu Manchu, I again fail to understand how a powerful, charismatic, sophisticated villain who holds 3 doctorates and never loses is bad. And if you want to complain about desexualization, I would actually argue that there is a very predatory and malicious sort of sexual undercurrent in the character, and that's not a bad thing. Considering the masturbatory popularity of 50 Shades of Grey and similar dreck amongst women today, which I will be talking about in a later video, I have a sneaking suspicion that if Fu Manchu movies were being made now, women might be doing the two-finger fillet to him. Now, of course, in all those cases, the Asian man was portrayed by a white man in makeup. I'm not saying the situation was perfect, far from it. Just that, there was effort being made, bullheaded and cloddish though it may have been, to positively, proactively portray ethnic and racial minorities purely out of the goodness of their hearts, instead of a never-ending maelstrom of petty white evil pettiness. On a vaguely similar note, movies like Taboo, White Shadows in the South Seas, and The Pagan, all silent films made at the latest 1932, take a pretty clear stand against colonialism in Polynesia, which is some food for thought for anybody who thinks that white people spent all their time running around yelling about how much they loved murdering shitskins up until like 3 weeks ago. In the 3 cases I cited, these films do admittedly take a somewhat stereotypical and patronizing view of people of color, but it is clear again that efforts are being made to portray them positively. One could argue that blacks and American Indians were portrayed the most negatively and the most stereotypically in cinema over the years, but even in those cases you had some positive portrayals here and there. The race films made by blacks for black audiences, criticizing various aspects of white supremacy, would seem to indicate there was at least some audience for them. And even as early as 1916, there were at least some attempts to portray American Indians relatively positively. As a related side note, the lukewarm bath of shame and guilt America has been in for the last 50 years has, ironically, led to a complete dearth of film roles for American Indian actors. I don't know about you, but I find it hilarious that SJW spent decades whining about the stereotyped Wild West view of American Indians and provided absolutely nothing to replace it. What about Hispanics, you might ask? By the 1950s, you had portrayals of white women being married and having kids with Hispanic men, and nobody cared. And that's all you need to say about that, really. And again, one could argue that the Latin lover is a stereotype in and of itself, but come the fuck on. As if all this wasn't surprising enough, there is one specific case where you can point to portrayals of a certain ethnic group being, on the whole, more positive in the past than they currently are: Arabs and Southwest Asians. I've said it before and I will say it again. People from the Middle East have almost always been considered more or less white in America up until the current year, when they realize that being white is a disadvantage and they're now fighting tooth and nail to not be white. And if you don't believe me, look at how in the past, light-skinned black people trying to pass as something other than black would often say they were, drumroll please, Arabs. As early as the silent era, and as late as the 1970s, there were countless swashbuckling films of derring do set in the hoary Orient with Arabian protagonists. Again, stereotyped and cliched, but not negative by any means. You'll notice that whenever Southwest Asian chatterers whine about stereotyping in media, it's always within the last 30 years they whine about. Could that possibly be that Arabs looked exotic and cool from a distance, and much less so when they were next door? All in all, as a person of color and a cinephile, it seems to me that while racism and stereotyping have certainly existed, there have been just as many good whites going out of their way to debunk stereotypes. And yet, the poor, benighted people of color still whine about these well-meaning, albeit somewhat naive and ignorant, portrayals. So to them, I say what I always say: either make your own damn movies, or kindly shut the hell up. I'm Larson Halleck, and that's my opinion.
And now a word from our sponsors. Hey folks, are you a fan of Larson Halleck and the Barbaric Gentleman? Of course you are, otherwise you wouldn't be watching. Do you want to help me out somehow? If so, here's how you can give me money. You can go to patreon.com/LarsonHalleck and give me some money. Or you can donate to me via PayPal, paypal.me/LarsonHalleck. Or buy my book. Otherwise, visit my Gab, my Twitter, and keep watching the videos.